The autumn of 1873 painted the Oregon Territory in shades of amber and crimson, while the wind carried whispers of war across the lava beds where the Modoc people had made their final stand. Ophelia McKenna pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she navigated the pine-thick forest, her leather satchel heavy with medicinal herbs and the weight of secrets that had driven her from the safety of her cabin. At 22, she possessed her late father's gift for healing, but unlike the respected Dr. McKenna, who had served both settlers and natives with equal compassion, Ophelia carried the burden of being a woman in a world that preferred its healers bearded and its women silent. The territory was bleeding from months of conflict between the Modoc tribe and the U.S. Army, a war that had torn families apart and left the land scarred with trenches and unmarked graves.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Most white settlers had fled south to the safety of Sacramento, but Ophelia remained in her father's cabin, tending to whoever needed healing, regardless of the color of their skin or the uniform they wore. Her uncle Jeremiah had written from San Francisco, demanding she abandon this fool's errand of mercy and join him in his lucrative land speculation business. But Ophelia had burned his letters without reply. The man who had raised her after her parents' death in a typhoid outbreak had grown cold and calculating, seeing opportunity in every tragedy and profit in every drop of blood spilled on territorial soil. The forest here was ancient and thick, where Douglas firs stretched toward heaven like cathedral spires, and the undergrowth grew so dense that daylight barely penetrated to the moss-covered floor. This was neutral ground, sacred to the Modoc people and avoided by most settlers, a place where the old spirits were said to still walk, and where the boundary between the living and dead grew thin. Ophelia had come here seeking white sage and juniper bark, medicines that could fight infection and ease the pain of the wounded soldiers who found their way to her door. But she had also come seeking solitude from the endless cycle of violence that seemed to consume everything in its path. Her father had taught her to read the forest like a book, to understand the language of broken branches and disturbed earth, to recognize the signs that spoke of human passage through nature's domain. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the more she noticed things that didn't belong, boot prints too large for any native foot, rope fibers caught on low branches, the lingering scent of fear and desperation that seemed to cling to the very air. Something had happened here recently, something that had left its mark on the forest's ancient silence. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the forest's natural symphony. It wasn't the call of a hawk or the rustle of small game through the underbrush, but something far more human and infinitely more desperate. The sound came again, weak and muffled, like someone calling from the bottom of a well, and Ophelia's trained ear recognized it immediately as the sound of a man fighting for his life. Help! The voice gasped, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles. Please ... anyone. Water! Ophelia froze, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol her father had taught her to carry. The forest had become a dangerous place for a woman alone, filled with deserters from both sides who had abandoned honor for survival and predators, who saw the chaos of war as an opportunity for darker appetites. But the voice that called out held no menace, only desperation and pain, and her healer's instincts overrode her caution like they always did when faced with human suffering. Following the sound through a maze of fallen logs and moss-slicked boulders, Ophelia pushed aside a curtain of fern fronds and stopped short. There, partially hidden beneath a rough covering of pine branches and forest debris, lay what appeared to be a grave. But graves didn't plead for help, and as she knelt beside the makeshift burial site, she could see fingers brown, strong, and very much alive clawing weakly at the earth from beneath. The soil was loose, recently disturbed, and someone had taken great care to make this look like a natural forest clearing, complete with scattered leaves and carefully placed stones. breath caught as she began tearing away the branches and dirt with desperate efficiency. This was no accidental burial. Someone had been deliberately entombed here, left to suffocate in the dark earth while the forest reclaimed their body. The rope bindings were military issue, the kind used by cavalry units, but the burial itself seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial in its deliberate cruelty. As she dug deeper, a face emerged from the darkness, weathered, proud, and bearing the distinctive features of the Modoc people chief Nashtek, even in the territories remote corners. His name was spoken with equal measures of respect and fear. He was the war leader who had held the U.S. Army at bay for months in the lava beds, a tactician whose knowledge of the terrain had made him nearly invincible against overwhelming odds. He was also the man whose people had been betrayed by their own government, promised peace and given exile, offered food and handed starvation. The newspapers in San Francisco had painted him as a savage, a bloodthirsty warrior who killed white settlers for sport. But Ophelia's father had spoken of him differently, as a man trying to protect his people's way of life against impossible odds. But now he lay buried alive in the forest floor, his powerful frame bound with rope, his war paint smeared with dirt and blood. His eyes, when they met hers, held no hatred despite everything his people had suffered at the hands of white settlers, only a desperate gratitude that spoke of a man who had given up hope of seeing another sunrise. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his breathing shallow, and Ophelia could see the telltale signs of a man who had been fighting suffocation for hours. "Who did this to you?" Ophelia whispered as she worked to free him, her fingers flying over the knots that bound his wrists and ankles. The rope was new, the kind used by the army, but the burial itself seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial in its deliberate cruelty. Someone had wanted him to suffer, to die slowly and in darkness, and the thought made her stomach turn. Nashtek's lips moved, but no sound emerged at first. His throat was parched, his voice nearly gone from calling for help that he must have believed would never come. Ophelia reached for her water flask, supporting his head as she helped him drink, watching color slowly return to his ashen features. His hands shook as he gripped the flask, and she could see the desperation in his eyes, not just for water, but for human contact, for the simple acknowledgement that he was still alive. "My own people," he finally managed, his voice like gravel over stone. "Why they believe I betrayed them. They think I sold our sacred places to the white gold hunters. They think I chose white silver over Modoc blood. Gold, silver," the words hung in the air between them like a curse. Ophelia had heard the rumors, whispered in the trading posts and saloons, stories of precious metals discovered in the lava beds, of rich veins hidden beneath the very ground the Modoc had fought to protect. But these were just stories, weren't they? The desperate fantasies of men who saw fortune in every shadow and opportunity in every tragedy. "There's gold," Nashtek continued, reading the question in her eyes. "More gold than the white men have ever dreamed of. Enough to buy armies, to fund wars, to make whoever controls it the most powerful man in all the territories. But the gold is cursed, tainted with the blood of my ancestors and the innocent. It was meant to be our salvation, our way to buy peace with the white government. Instead, it became our damnation." Ophelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She had seen the aftermath of gold rushes, had tended to the wounded and dying who fought over claims and fortunes that existed only in their fevered imaginations. But this was different. This was real gold, enough to change the balance of power in the entire territory, and it was hidden beneath sacred ground that had already been soaked with blood. "Where?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Nashtek's eyes closed, and for a moment she thought he had lost consciousness. Then he spoke, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and the finality of a death sentence. "The sacred caves, beneath the lava beds. My ancestors buried it there centuries ago when the first white men came to our lands.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
They knew what would happen if the gold was discovered, knew that our people would be slaughtered for it. So they hid it deep in the earth, in places where only the spirits of the dead could guard it. The world seemed to tilt around Ophelia as the full implication of his words sank in. The Modoc hadn't just been fighting for their ancestral lands, they had been protecting a treasure that could reshape the entire territory. And now she, a white woman, a healer who had sworn to help anyone in need, had become keeper of the most dangerous secret in the Oregon Territory. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nashtak's eyes opened, and she saw in them a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "Because you saved my life when you could have walked away. Because your father once treated my son's fever when the army doctors refused to help. Because you are not like the others who see only red skin and assume monster beneath." He struggled to sit up, his bound hands reaching toward her with desperate urgency. "They buried me alive because I opposed the killing. When white prospectors came too close to our secret, when soldiers patrolled near the sacred caves, my warriors wanted to kill them all. I tried to find another way, tried to negotiate, to mislead, to frighten them away without bloodshed. But my own war council turned against me, said I had grown soft, that I cared more for white lives than Modoc survival. What happened to the prospectors?" Ophelia demanded, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Nashtak said simply, "All of them. 17 men over the past 2 years, their bodies hidden in the caves with the gold. My warriors made it look like accidents, like they had gotten lost in the lava tubes or fallen into crevices. But I knew the truth. I knew we had become the very monsters the white newspapers claimed we were." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Ophelia's mind. The missing traders who had vanished near the lava beds. The explorers who had set out to map the territory and never returned. The soldiers who had gone on patrol and simply disappeared, their bodies never found. All of them had gotten too close to the Modoc secret, and all of them had paid with their lives. "That's why you went to the army," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You were going to confess everything, to tell them about the gold. And the bodies." "I was going to try to save my people," Nashtak replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I thought if I could lead the army to the gold, if I could prove that we were willing to share it, then maybe there could be peace. Maybe the killing could stop before it consumed everything I had ever loved. But your own warriors discovered your plan," Ophelia said. "They followed me to the meeting place. They heard me talking to the army scout, heard me offer to reveal the location of the gold in exchange for safe passage for my people to a reservation. They said I had become a traitor, that I cared more for white lives than Modoc honor. But they were wrong. I care for all lives, and I cannot let my people continue down this path of blood and darkness." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as Ophelia processed everything she had learned. In the space of an hour, she had gone from a simple healer gathering herbs to a woman who held the key to the greatest conspiracy in the territory's history. The knowledge was a burden she wasn't sure she could carry, but it was also a responsibility she couldn't ignore. "The scout you were meeting," she said suddenly. "What happened to him?" Nashtak's face darkened. "Dead. My warriors killed him before he could return to the fort. Made it look like a Modoc ambush, just another casualty of the war. But his death will bring more soldiers, more questions, more killing. The cycle will never end unless someone breaks it. What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. Nashtak's eyes met hers, and she saw in them a mixture of hope and desperation that reminded her of her father's final patience, the ones who had known they were dying but still fought for one more day, one more chance to make things right. "Help me save my people," he said. "Help me find a way to stop this madness before it destroys everything we have ever loved." The gold is still there, still waiting to corrupt whoever claims it. If we can find a way to expose the truth without condemning every Modoc to death, then perhaps some good can come from all this bloodshed. Ophelia looked down at the man she had pulled from his living grave. This proud chief who had chosen truth over tribal loyalty, who had risked everything to stop the cycle of violence that was consuming his people. She thought of her father, who had always taught her that healing sometimes meant making difficult choices, that sometimes the greatest mercy was the hardest truth. "I'll help you," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "But we do this my way. No more killing, no more hiding bodies in sacred caves. We find a way to make this right without adding to the mountain of corpses." Nashtek nodded, relief flooding his features. "Agreed. But you must understand, there are those on both sides who will kill to keep this secret buried. My own people will see me as a traitor, and your people will see me as a monster. We will have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, then. We'll face them together," Ophelia said, helping him to his feet. "My father always said that the truth was like a wound. It might hurt to clean it, but it's the only way to prevent infection from spreading." As they prepared to leave the forest, clearing where Nashtek's burial site had nearly become his final resting place, Ophelia felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. She had come to the woods seeking healing herbs and found instead a man whose truth could reshape the entire territory. The path ahead would be treacherous, filled with enemies on all sides and choices that would test every principle she held. Dear but, as she looked at Chief Nashtek, this man who had chosen conscience over comfort, truth over tribal loyalty, she knew that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. The gold beneath the lava beds had already claimed too many lives, had already corrupted too many souls. It was time to bring the darkness into the light. No matter who might be burned by its glare, the forest watched them go, two unlikely allies, united by a shared commitment to justice and a secret that could either save or damn them both. Behind them, the disturbed earth where Nashtek had been buried alive slowly began to settle, as if the forest itself was trying to forget the evil that had been done in its shadow. The abandoned mine shaft carved into the hillside like a wound. In the earth, its mouth yawning black against the gray afternoon sky. Ophelia McKenna followed Chief Nashtek through the scattered remnants of a prospector's camp-rusted pans, broken sluice boxes, and the bleached bones of pack animals that had died in the harsh Oregon winter. This was where they had agreed to meet after fleeing the forest, a place where desperate men had once clawed at the earth, searching for riches that had always remained just beyond their reach. 2 days had passed since she had pulled Nashtek from his living grave, 2 days of careful planning and whispered conversations in the hidden places where neither army patrols nor Modoc warriors would think to look. They had made their camp in the ruins of an old trading post, its walls scarred by rifle fire from some long-forgotten skirmish, its roof collapsed inward like a broken promise. Here, surrounded by the detritus of failed dreams and abandoned hopes, they had begun to piece together a plan that might save both their peoples from the curse of gold that lay hidden beneath the sacred caves. "My warriors will be hunting for me," Nashtek said as he checked the horizon for signs of pursuit. "They know I am alive now, know that I escaped the burial they intended as my final punishment. They will not rest until they find me, until they silence the truth I carry forever." Ophelia nodded, her hands steady as she cleaned and loaded her father's old rifle. She had never killed a man, had dedicated her life to healing rather than harming, but the weight of the weapon in her hands felt oddly comforting. The world had become a dangerous place for anyone who knew the secret of the Modoc gold, and she understood now that knowledge could be deadlier than any poison. "Tell me about the caves," she said, settling beside him on a fallen log. "Tell me everything you know about the gold and the bodies hidden there." Nashtek's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing something that existed beyond the physical world. "The caves are older than memory, carved by the spirits of fire and Water in the time before the first Modoc walked this land. My ancestors discovered them during the Great Winter, when the snow fell for 7 moons and the people were starving. They found gold there, more gold than they had ever imagined, but they also found something else, a warning written in the old tongue on the cave walls. What kind of warning? Ophelia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. That the gold was cursed, that it would bring death to any who removed it from the sacred earth. The spirits had placed it there as a test, to see if the people would choose wisdom over greed, spiritual wealth over material riches. My ancestors chose wisely. They left the gold where it lay and sealed the caves with sacred stones, marking them as forbidden ground. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant wood smoke. Somewhere in the territory, men were gathering around campfires, sharing stories and planning their next moves in the endless game of survival that had consumed the Oregon Territory. But here, in this abandoned place where dreams had come to die, Ophelia felt as if she and Nashtak were the only 2 people left in the world. But the caves were opened again, she said, understanding the inevitable tragedy that had followed 5 years ago when the army first came to our lands. They brought geologists, men who studied the earth and spoke of mineral deposits and ore formations. These men had instruments that could detect gold even when it was hidden deep underground. They found the caves, broke through the sacred seals, and discovered the treasure that my ancestors had chosen to leave untouched. Nashtak's voice grew heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. But the army men were not alone. They had made a deal with someone who had promised them safe passage through Modoc territory in exchange for a share of whatever they found. Someone who knew our customs, our sacred places, our weaknesses. Who? Ophelia asked, though a cold dread was beginning to form in her stomach. Your uncle, Nashtak said quietly. Jeremiah McKenna. He was the one who guided the army geologists to the caves, who told them which stones to move and which passages to follow. He was the one who made the deal that started all the killing. The world seemed to stop spinning around Ophelia as the full horror of the revelation crashed over her like a wave. Her uncle, the man who had raised her after her parents' death, the man who had begged her to abandon her healing work and join him in San Francisco. He was the architect of the entire conspiracy. He had sold the Modoc sacred places to the army, had set in motion the chain of events that had led to so much death and suffering. You're lying, she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Too many pieces of the puzzle suddenly made sense. Her uncle's mysterious wealth, his sudden departure from the territory, his insistence that she abandon her work and join him in California. He had been running from the consequences of his actions, trying to get as far away as possible from the blood that had been spilled in his name. I wish I were, Nashtak replied. But I saw him there, in the caves, when my warriors first discovered the army men. He was directing them, telling them where to dig, how to extract the gold without bringing down the cave roof. He knew the caves better than any white man should. Have new secrets that only the Modoc elders should have possessed. How? Ophelia asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. Your father, Nashtak said gently. Dr. McKenna had been treating our people for years, had earned our trust and respect. We shared things with him that we shared with no other white man, stories of our ancestors, descriptions of our sacred places, even rough maps of the cave systems. He was a good man, a healer who saw beyond the color of skin to the humanity beneath. But he was also a man who trusted his brother, who spoke freely of what he had learned. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Ophelia had ever treated. Her father, the man she had idolized, the healer who had taught her that all life was sacred, he had unknowingly provided the information that had led to the desecration of the Modoc sacred places. And her uncle had taken that information and used it to build a fortune on the bones of the dead, the army men who found the Kikarain. Gold, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to them? Dead, all of them. But not killed by my warriors, not at first. They were killed by your uncle's men. Mercenaries he had hired to make sure that knowledge of the gold never reached the territorial government. He wanted to control the secret, to be the only one who knew where the treasure was hidden. Nashtak stood and began pacing, his movements sharp with barely contained anger. But killing the army men was not enough. Other people had seen them entering Modoc territory, had heard rumors of their mission. Prospectors began coming to the area. Traders started asking questions. Soldiers were sent to investigate the missing men. Each new arrival brought the risk of discovery, and each new arrival had to be eliminated. That's when your warriors became involved, Ophelia said. Understanding the terrible logic that had led to so much bloodshed, my war council saw the white men as a threat to our sacred places, as defilers who would destroy everything we held holy. They did not know about your uncle's involvement, did not understand that the army men were already dead. They only knew that white men were coming to the caves, and they responded as warriors have always responded to threats against their people. The rain began to fall, soft drops that pattered against the broken roof of the abandoned trading post. Ophelia pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold that gripped her had nothing to do with the weather. She was beginning to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, the web of lies and murder that had entangled both peoples in a tragedy that seemed to have no end. 17 men, she said, remembering the number Nashtak had mentioned before. 17 men killed by your warriors, their bodies hidden in the caves with the gold. 17 men who came too close to the truth, Nashtak confirmed. Prospectors, traders, soldiers, even a federal marshal who had been sent to investigate. The missing army men. All of them died because they had the misfortune to discover what your uncle wanted to keep hidden. And you tried to stop it, Ophelia said, seeing the pain in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that had driven him to attempt the desperate negotiation that had led to his own people turning against him. I tried, Nashtak said, but I was already too late. The killing had become a way of life for my warriors, a sacred duty to protect our ancestors' resting place. They saw each new death as a victory, each hidden body as proof of their devotion to the old ways. They did not understand that they were simply tools in your uncle's scheme, that they were doing his killing for him. The implications of what Nashtak was revealing began to dawn on Ophelia with sickening clarity. Her uncle had not just stolen Modoc gold, he had orchestrated a campaign of murder that had turned the Modoc warriors into his unwitting accomplices. Every death, every hidden body, every act of violence had served his purpose of keeping the secret buried while he figured out how to extract the treasure without being caught. He's planning to come back, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. That's why he's been so insistent that I leave the territory, why he's been trying to get me to San Francisco. He's waiting for the war to end, for the Modoc to be defeated and relocated, so he can return and claim the gold without interference. Nashtak nodded grimly. The war will end soon. My people are starving, running out of ammunition, losing hope. When they surrender, when they are marched away to a reservation far from this land, there will be no one left to guard the caves. Your uncle will return with his mercenaries, will extract the gold, and will leave nothing but empty holes where our ancestors once rested. Unless we stop him, Ophelia said, her voice hardening with determination. Unless we stop him, Nashtak agreed. But to do that, we need proof. We need evidence that will convince the territorial government that your uncle is behind the killings, that he has been using the war to cover his crimes. Without proof, we are just two people with an incredible story that no one will believe. Ophelia thought of her uncle's letters, the ones she had burned without reading. Had they contained hints of his true activities? Had he been careless enough to put something in writing that could be used against him? She cursed herself for destroying them, for letting emotion override the practical necessity of gathering evidence. The caves, she said suddenly. The bodies are still there, aren't they? If we could find them, if we could prove that these men were murdered and hidden, that would be evidence enough to hang your uncle and his mercenaries. The caves are heavily guarded, Nashtak warned. My warriors patrol them constantly, and they have orders to kill anyone who approaches. Even if we could get past them, even if we could find the bodies, how would we get that information to the authorities? Who would believe a wanted Modoc chief and a woman who has been living alone in the wilderness? Colonel Harrison, Ophelia said, remembering the army officer who had occasionally stopped at her father's clinic for treatment of his chronic back pain. He's an honorable man. Someone who cares more about justice than politics. If we could get the evidence to him, if we could prove what's been happening, he would act on it. And if he doesn't believe us? Nashtak asked. If he thinks we're just trying to create a diversion, to shift blame away from the Modoc people, then we'll have to make him believe, Ophelia said, her mind racing with possibilities. We'll have to find a way to make the evidence so compelling, so undeniable, that he'll have no choice but to act on it. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the broken roof with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The storm was coming, and with it would come the final confrontation that would determine the fate of both peoples. There's something else, Nashtak said quietly. Something I haven't told you about the caves, about what else is hidden there. What? Ophelia asked, though she wasn't sure she could handle any more revelations. Documents, Nashtak said. Your uncle left papers in the caves, maps and agreements and lists of names. I think he was using the caves as a kind of headquarters, a place where he could meet with his mercenaries and plan their operations. If those documents are still there, if they haven't been destroyed, they might contain all the evidence we need. Hope flared in Ophelia's chest like a candle flame in the darkness. If her uncle had been careless, if he had left behind written proof of his crimes, then there might be a way to expose the truth without having to explain the supernatural elements of how she had discovered it. We have to get to those caves, she said. We have to find those documents before your uncle returns, before he has a chance to destroy the evidence. It will be dangerous, Nashtak warned. My warriors will shoot first and ask questions later. They see any white person as a threat, any approach to the caves as an attack on our sacred places. And even if we survive the journey, even if we find the documents, we'll still have to get them to Colonel Harrison without being killed by either side. Then we'll have to be clever, Ophelia said, her mind already working on the logistics of the plan. We'll have to find a way to get into the caves without being seen, to get the evidence without alerting your warriors, and to get it to the colonel without being intercepted by your uncle's men. And if we fail? Nashtak asked. If we're caught? If the evidence is destroyed, if your uncle succeeds in his plan, then the killing will never stop, Ophelia said simply. The gold will corrupt everyone who touches it. The truth will remain buried with the dead. And both our peoples will be destroyed by the lies that have been told in their name. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the rain and the distant thunder, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible task that lay ahead. Finally, Nashtak spoke, his voice quiet but determined. When do we leave for the caves? Tomorrow night, Ophelia said. Under cover of darkness, when the storm will mask our movements and the guards will be seeking shelter. We'll have one chance to get this right, one opportunity to find the evidence that will expose the truth. And if we don't survive, then at least we'll die trying to do what's right, Ophelia said, her hand moving to rest on the grip of her father's pistol. At least we'll die fighting for something bigger than ourselves. The storm was growing stronger, and with it came the promise of the battle that would determine whether justice would prevail, or whether the curse of gold would continue to claim innocent lives. Tomorrow night, they would venture into the heart of darkness, into the sacred caves where the dead kept their silent vigil over the treasure that had cost so many lives. But tonight, they would prepare for war. The lava beds stretched before them like a moonscape carved from nightmares, twisted black rock formations that jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. Ophelia McKenna crouched beside Chief Nashtak in the shadow of a towering basalt outcrop, her heart hammering against her ribs as she studied the maze of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the sacred ground below. 3 days had passed since their conversation at the abandoned trading post. 3 days of careful reconnaissance and desperate planning. And now the moment of truth had arrived with the weight of inevitability. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear night that offered no concealment from the Modoc sentries who patrolled the perimeter of the sacred caves. Ophelia could see them moving like shadows between the rock formations, their painted faces ghostly in the starlight, their weapons gleaming with deadly purpose. These were not the desperate warriors of newspaper accounts, but skilled fighters, defending ground they considered more precious than their own lives. 7 guards, Nashtak whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that moaned through the lava tubes. 2 at the main entrance, 2 more at the northern passage, 1 at the water source, and 2 others who patrol the outer perimeter. They changed positions every hour, following patterns that were taught to them by their grandfathers. Ophelia nodded, her fingers checking the contents of her leather satchel one final time. Medical supplies, rope, a small lantern, and the brass compass her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Tools that seemed pitifully inadequate for the task ahead. But she had learned from her father that healing sometimes required going into dangerous places, that sometimes the greatest cures could only be found in the deepest wounds. The documents you mentioned, she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Where exactly did you see them? In the Chamber of Echoes, Nashtak replied, his eyes never leaving the guards below. The deepest part of the cave system, where the walls are covered with the drawings of our ancestors. Your uncle used it as his meeting place because sound travels strangely. Their whispers can be heard clearly, but shouts are swallowed by the stone. He thought it was the perfect place for secret conversations, the Chamber of Echoes. Even the name sent chills down Ophelia's spine. She had heard stories of the place from her father. Tales of Modoc ceremonies conducted in absolute darkness, of spiritual journeys that took warriors to the edge of death and back again. It was a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin, where the living could speak with the dead. And the bodies? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Scattered throughout the cave system, Nashtak said grimly. Your uncle's men would bring them in during the dark of the moon, when my warriors were conducting their own ceremonies and would not notice the additional activity. They were placed inside chambers, in crevices where the rock had natural shelves. Some were simply thrown into the deep pools where the underground rivers flow. Ophelia closed her eyes, trying to imagine the horror of what they would find in the caves. 17 men, murdered and hidden away like shameful secrets, their families still wondering what had happened to them. The thought filled her with a rage that burned hotter than any fever she had ever treated. There's something else, Nashtak said, his voice carrying a note of reluctance. Something I haven't told you about the caves, about what happens to people who enter them uninvited. What do you mean? Ophelia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The caves are protected by more than just my warriors, Nashtak said. They are protected by the spirits of our ancestors, by forces that do not distinguish between friend and enemy. Many who have entered the caves without permission have never emerged, even when they were armed and prepared for danger. You're trying to frighten me, Ophelia said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. I'm trying to warn you, Nashtak replied. The spirits know that the sacred places have been defiled, that blood has been spilled where only prayers should have been offered. They are angry, and their anger does not discriminate. We may face dangers in those caves that no weapon can defeat, threats that no amount of preparation can overcome. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else that smelled like copper and decay. Ophelia shivered, pulling her father's coat tighter around her shoulders. She had never been a superstitious woman, had always believed in the power of reason and science over fear and folklore. But something about this place, about the way the very air seemed to thrum with unseen energy, made her question everything she thought she knew about the world. "The Northern Passage," she said, forcing herself to focus on the practical aspects of their mission. "You said there were only 2 guards there. Can we get past them? Not without alerting the others," Nashtak said. "But there is another way. A passage that most of my people have forgotten. One that was sealed many years ago after a young warrior became lost in its depths. It connects to the main cave system, but it requires crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a man's shoulders." "Show me," Ophelia said. Though the thought of crawling through narrow underground tunnels made her stomach turn, Nashtak led her on the perimeter of the lava beds, staying well away from the patrol routes his warriors followed. The ground here was treacherous, covered with loose rock and hidden crevices that could trap an unwary foot or turn an ankle. More than once, Ophelia had to bite back a cry of pain as sharp stones cut through her boots. As thorny scrub brush caught at her clothing, they moved. Like ghosts through the darkness, 2 figures bound together by a shared purpose and a secret that could destroy them both. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, offering no comfort to the small human drama playing out far below. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to carry all the loneliness and desperation of the frontier night. "Here," Nashtak said, stopping beside what appeared to be a solid wall of basalt. But as Ophelia looked closer, she could see that the rock had been fractured by some ancient upheaval, creating a crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The opening was partially concealed by scrub brush and fallen stones, as if nature itself was trying to keep the passage hidden from prying eyes. "This leads to the caves?" she asked, staring at the narrow fissure with growing dread. "To the oldest part of the cave system," Nashtak confirmed. "The passages are tight, and in some places you will have to crawl on your belly like a snake. But it will take us directly to the Chamber of Echoes, bypassing all the guards and sentries." Ophelia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had always been uncomfortable in tight spaces, had avoided even the root cellar at her father's clinic whenever possible. But this was their only chance to reach the evidence that could expose her uncle's crimes, their only opportunity to prevent even more bloodshed. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you be able to fit through the passage?" "I will manage," Nashtak said, though she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I have been in these caves many times, know their moods and their dangers. But you must promise me something. If we become separated, if something happens to me, you must continue alone. You must find the documents and get them to your Colonel Harrison, no matter what the cost." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Ophelia said firmly. "We're going to get through this together, find the evidence, and expose the truth. Both of us." "And if we don't?" Nashtak asked. "If the spirits claim us, if the caves become our tomb." "What then?" "Then at least we'll die trying to do what's right," Ophelia said, echoing the words she had spoken at the trading post. "At least we'll die fighting for something bigger than ourselves." They squeezed through the narrow opening one at a time, Nashtak leading the way with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life moving through difficult terrain. The passage was even tighter than it had appeared from the outside, forcing them to turn sideways and duck their heads to avoid the jagged ceiling. The walls seemed to press in on them from all sides, and Ophelia had to fight down waves of panic as the darkness closed around them like a living thing. The air in the passage was thick and stale, carrying the scent of minerals and something else, something that smelled like ancient death and forgotten prayers. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow space, creating phantom sounds that seemed to come from all directions at once. More than once, Ophelia found herself looking over her shoulder, convinced that something was following them through the darkness. How much further? She whispered, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to keep her voice low. Not far now. Nashtak replied, his words barely audible above the sound of their labored breathing. The passage opens into a small chamber, and from there we can access the main cave system. But we must be careful. Sound travels far in these caves, and even the smallest noise could alert the guards. They pressed on through the claustrophobic passage, each step taking them deeper into the heart of the sacred mountain. The walls here were covered with strange markings, symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light of their small lantern. Ophelia found herself staring at the ancient drawings, trying to decipher their meaning, trying to understand the messages that had been left by people who had walked these paths centuries before, the old ones. Nashtak said, noticing her fascination with the cave paintings. They used these caves for vision quests, for ceremonies that connected them to the spirit world. The drawings tell the story of our people, of our relationship with the land and the powers that dwell beneath it. What do they say about the gold? Ophelia asked, running her fingers over a particularly intricate symbol that seemed to glow with its own inner light. That it is a test, Nashtak said. A challenge placed here by the spirits to see if we would choose wisdom over greed, spiritual wealth over material riches. The old ones passed the test, left the gold untouched for generations. But we have failed. The passage finally opened into a small chamber carved from the living rock, its walls smooth and polished by centuries of use. The air here was fresher, carrying with it the sound of distant water and the whisper of wind through hidden passages. Ophelia felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she straightened up, grateful to be out of the narrow confines of the access tunnel. From here we follow the main passage to the Chamber of Echoes, Nashtak said, checking the loads in his rifle. But we must be silent, must move like shadows. The guards patrol these tunnels regularly, and they know every sound, every echo. They move deeper into the cave system, following passages that seem to have been carved by forces beyond human comprehension. The walls here were covered with crystals that caught and reflected their lantern light, creating patterns that danced and swirled like living things. The floor was smooth and worn, polished by countless feet over countless generations. Stop, Nashtak said suddenly, raising his hand and warning. Ophelia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened for whatever had alarmed him. At first, she heard nothing but the distant sound of dripping water and the whisper of air through stone passages. Then, gradually she became aware of another sound, voices low and urgent, coming from somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. English. She whispered, recognizing the language though she couldn't make out the words. Someone speaking English in the caves. Nashtak's face darkened with anger and understanding. Your uncle, he said. He's here, in the sacred caves even now. He couldn't wait for the war to end. Couldn't wait for my people to be defeated and relocated. He's come back for the gold. The implications hit Ophelia like a physical blow. If her uncle was here, if he had returned to claim the treasure, then everything they had planned was in jeopardy. He would have brought his mercenaries with him. Armed men who would kill anyone who threatened their operations. The evidence they sought might already be destroyed. The bodies moved to new hiding places. The truth buried even deeper than before. We have to stop him, she said, her voice tight with determination. We have to find those documents before he destroys them. It's too dangerous, Nashtak warned. If he's here with his men, if they're armed and prepared for trouble, we don't stand a chance. We should retreat, find another way to expose his crimes. There is no other way, Ophelia said firmly. This is our only chance to get the evidence, our only opportunity to prove what he's done. If we run now, if we let him take the gold and destroy the documents, the truth will die with us. They pressed forward, moving with even greater caution as the voices grew louder and more distinct. The passage ahead was lit by the flickering glow of torches, and Ophelia could see shadows moving against the cave walls, men working with picks and shovels, loading bags with something that gleamed in the firelight. Gold, she breathed, staring at the scene before them. They're mining the gold, taking it from the sacred caves, and desecrating the resting places of our ancestors, Nashtak said, his voice thick with rage. Look, they've moved the bodies, piled them in the corner like refuse. They're treating our dead like obstacles to be cleared away. Ophelia felt bile rise in her throat as she saw the grisly pile of remains that had been carelessly stacked against one wall of the chamber. These were the missing men, the 17 victims of her uncle's greed, their bodies desecrated and dishonored even in death. The sight filled her with a fury that burned hotter than any fever she had ever treated. Jeremiah, she whispered, recognizing the familiar figure directing the mining operation. Her uncle looked older than she remembered, his hair gone completely gray, his face lined with the weight of his crimes. But his eyes still held the calculating coldness that had always made her uncomfortable, the look of a man who saw other people as nothing more than tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. We need to get closer, she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the mining operation. We need to find those documents, get proof of what he's done. And then what? Nashtak asked. Even if we find the evidence, even if we can prove his guilt, how do we get out of here alive? He has at least 6 men with him, all armed, all willing to kill to protect their secret. We'll find a way, Ophelia said, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. We have to find a way. They crept closer to the mining operation, using the natural formations of the cave to conceal their movements. The air here was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder, evidence that explosives had been used to break through the sealed passages. The sound of picks striking stone echoed through the chamber, accompanied by the harsh voices of men driven by greed and desperation. Check the side passages. Jeremiah's voice rang out clearly. Make sure we haven't missed anything. I want every ounce of gold removed from these caves before dawn. What about the bodies? One of the mercenaries asked. Should we move them to the deep pools like before? Leave them, Jeremiah said dismissively. After tonight, it won't matter. The Modoc will be blamed for everything, and will be long gone with our fortune. Let the army find the bodies when they come to clear out the caves. Ophelia gripped Nashtak's arm, feeling the tremor of rage that ran through his powerful frame. Her uncle was planning to frame the Modoc people for the murders he had orchestrated, to use their deaths as justification for even greater violence against the surviving tribal members. The scope of his evil was breathtaking in its callousness. The documents, she whispered urgently. We need to find the documents. They searched the chamber with desperate efficiency, looking for any sign of the papers that could expose her uncle's crimes. The mining operation provided cover for their movements, the sound of picks and shovels, masking their footsteps as they checked crevices and alcoves throughout the cave system. Finally, in a small side chamber that had been used as a storage area, Ophelia found what they were looking for. A leather satchel, hidden behind a stack of mining supplies, containing maps, contracts, and correspondence that detailed every aspect of her uncle's criminal enterprise. The evidence was damning, conclusive proof of his guilt that no court in the territory could ignore. "I've found them," she whispered to Nashtak, her hands shaking as she rifled through the documents. Maps showing the location of the caves, contracts with the mercenaries, even a list of the men who were killed to protect the secret. "This is everything we need, then we leave," Nashtak said urgently. "Now before, well," a cold voice said from the entrance to the chamber. "My dear niece, always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." They turned to find Jeremiah McKenna, standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his armed mercenaries. His face was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes held the dead coldness of a man who had moved far beyond the reach of human compassion. "Uncle," Ophelia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I should have known you'd be here, looting sacred graves and dishonoring the dead. Sacred graves?" Jeremiah laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "These are just holes in the ground, filled with rocks and bones and enough gold to buy half of California. Sentiment is a luxury I can't afford, my dear." "The documents," one of the mercenaries said, gesturing at the satchel in Ophelia's hands. "She's found the papers." "Yes," Jeremiah said, his smile growing wider and more terrible. "She always was too curious for her own good. Just like her father, always thinking she could heal the world, always believing that truth and justice actually mattered." "They do matter," Ophelia said, clutching the satchel tighter. "These documents will expose everything you've done, will show the world what kind of monster you really are." "No," Jeremiah said simply. "They won't, because you're not leaving this cave alive." "None of you are." The mercenaries raised their weapons, and Ophelia felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a shroud. They had found the evidence, had uncovered the truth. That could save both peoples from the curse of gold and blood. But now in the depths of the sacred caves, with the bones of the dead as witnesses, they would have to fight for the right to carry that truth back to the world above. The chamber erupted into chaos as Nashtak lunged forward, his war cry echoing through the stone passages like the voice of an avenging spirit. The battle for the truth had begun, and its outcome would determine the fate of everyone who had been touched by the curse of the Modoc gold. The gunshot echoed through the sacred chamber like thunder, its report amplified by the stone walls, until it became a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Ophelia McKenna threw herself behind a natural rock formation as bullets whined past her head, the leather satchel containing the incriminating documents clutched against her chest like a shield. Chief Nashtak had vanished into the shadows, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to fight in darkness, his presence marked only by the occasional flash of steel and the startled cries of her uncle's mercenaries. "Find them." Jeremiah McKenna's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I want those documents, and I want them both dead. No witnesses, no loose ends." The mining operation had ground to a halt, the hired workers fleeing deeper into the cave system as the sound of gunfire filled the air. Torches had been knocked over in the confusion, their flames casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like demons celebrating the violence that had finally erupted in this sacred place. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the ancient smell of stone and earth, creating an atmosphere that was both terrible and strangely appropriate for the confrontation that had been building for so long. Ophelia peered around the edge of her rocky shelter, trying to spot her uncle's position in the flickering light. She could see two of his mercenaries moving cautiously through the chamber, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. A third man lay motionless near the entrance, blood pooling beneath his body. Nashtak's work, she realized, feeling a grim satisfaction at the sight. "You can't hide forever, my dear," Jeremiah called out, his voice carrying the false warmth that had always made her skin crawl. "This cave system is vast, but it's not infinite. We'll find you eventually, and when we do, your death will be far less pleasant than it needs to be. Go to hell," Ophelia shouted back, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. She had never used such language before, had been raised to be a proper lady, even in the rough frontier society of the Oregon Territory. But something about this place, about the evil that had been done here, had stripped away all pretense of civilization. A shadow moved to her left, and she spun around to find Nashtak crouched beside her, his face streaked with blood and dirt. His rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the darkness, but he still carried his knife and the fierce determination that had made him a legend among both his own people and their enemies. "How many?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above The sound of her own racing heartbeat. 3 left, including your uncle, Nashtak replied, his eyes never leaving the chamber beyond their shelter. But they're spread out, covering all the exits. We're trapped. The documents, Ophelia said, patting the satchel to make sure it was still secure. We have to get these to Colonel Harrison, have to make sure the truth comes out. We have to survive first, Nashtak said grimly. Your uncle didn't become wealthy by being careless. He's planned for this contingency, has escape routes and contingency plans that we don't know about. As if summoned by their conversation, Jeremir's voice echoed through the chamber again, but this time it carried a different tone, one of smug satisfaction that made Ophelia's blood run cold. Did you really think I came here alone? He called out. Did you imagine that I would enter these caves without adequate protection? My dear niece, you always were too trusting for your own good. The sound of marching feet echoed through the stone passages, growing louder with each passing second. Ophelia felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. Her uncle had brought reinforcements, had positioned additional men throughout the cave system to ensure that no one could escape with knowledge of his crimes. Army boots. Nashtak sighed, his face darkening with understanding. But not regular soldiers. These are his private army, mercenaries dressed in military uniforms to confuse anyone who might see them. The reinforcements poured into the chamber like a tide of violence, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight, their faces hard with the kind of cruelty that came from years of killing for money rather than principle. Ophelia counted at least 8 men, all armed with the latest rifles, all moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers. Surround them, Jeremir commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had grown accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. But be careful, I want the documents intact, and I want them both alive long enough to tell me what they know. The mercenaries spread out through the chamber, their movements coordinated and efficient. There was no escape now, no way to slip past so many armed men in the confined space of the cave. Ophelia felt despair settling over her like a shroud, the weight of failure crushing her spirit, even as she clutched the evidence that could have saved so many lives. This is where it ends, she whispered to Nashtak, her voice thick with unshed tears. This is where we die, and the truth dies with us. Not yet, Nashtak said, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Not while I still draw breath. My ancestors fought and died in these caves, and their spirits will not let evil triumph in this sacred place. He rose from their shelter with a war cry that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, launching himself at the nearest mercenary with a fury that was both terrible and beautiful to behold. The man went down under Nashtak's assault, his rifle clattering across the stone floor as the chief's blade found its mark. But there were too many of them, too many weapons pointed at the brave warrior who had chosen to make his final stand in the sacred caves of his people. Gunfire erupted from all directions, the muzzle flashes strobing like lightning as the mercenaries opened fire on the Modoc chief. No! Ophelia screamed, rising from her own shelter without thought for her safety. She saw Nashtak stagger, saw blood bloom across his chest like a crimson flower, saw him fall to his knees even as he continued to fight with the desperate courage of a man who knew he was dying. The sight of his sacrifice broke something inside her, released a fury that she had never known she possessed. She drew her father's pistol, the weapon feeling heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, and began firing at the mercenaries with a precision that surprised even her. 2 men fell before they could react, their blood mixing with the ancient dust of the cave floor. Enough! Jeremir's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Take her alive. I want to know what she's learned. Want to know who else knows about our operations. The remaining mercenaries closed in, their weapons trained on her, but their trigger fingers held in check by their employer's orders. Ophelia stood over Nashtak's fallen form, her pistol empty, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder residue. The satchel of documents lay at her feet, the evidence that had cost so many lives to obtain. "My dear niece," Jeremiah said, stepping forward with the confident stride of a man who had won a decisive victory. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, but I must admit, I'm impressed by your resourcefulness. Your father would be proud." "Don't you dare speak of my father," Ophelia snarled, her voice raw with grief and rage. "He was a healer, a man who saved lives instead of taking them. He would be ashamed to know what you've become." "Your father was a fool," Jeremiah said dismissively. "A brilliant doctor certainly, but a fool nonetheless. He could have been wealthy, could have used his connections with the Indians to build a fortune that would have lasted generations. Instead, he chose to waste his talents on charity cases and lost causes. He chose to save lives," Ophelia said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He chose to heal instead of harm, to build instead of destroy. That's not foolishness, that's honor." "Honor doesn't pay the bills," Jeremiah replied with a cold smile. "Honor doesn't buy land or influence or power. Your father died poor and forgotten, while I've built an empire on the foundation of practical thinking and decisive action. You've built a mountain of corpses," Ophelia said, gesturing at the pile of bodies that had been carelessly stacked against the cave wall. 17 men, murdered for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "How many more will die to protect your precious secret?" "As many as necessary," Jeremiah said without hesitation. "I've come too far to be stopped by sentiment or squeamishness. The gold in these caves is worth more than the lives of every Indian in the territory, more than the lives of every settler who might stumble across our operations." He gestured to one of his mercenaries, who stepped forward and picked up the leather satchel from the cave floor. "These documents would have been problematic if they had reached the wrong hands," Jeremiah continued. "But fortunately, they'll never leave this cave. Just like you, my dear." "Colonel Harrison knows I'm here," Ophelia lied, hoping to buy time. Hoping for some miracle that might still save them. "If I don't return by dawn, he'll come looking for me with a full company of soldiers. Colonel Harrison is dead," Jeremiah said simply, and Ophelia felt the world tilt around her as the implications of his words sank in. "Shot by Indians while investigating reports of missing soldiers. Tragic, really, but these things happen in wartime." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Colonel Harrison had been their only hope, the one honest man in the territorial government who might have acted on the evidence they had gathered. If he was dead, if her uncle had orchestrated his murder as well, then there was no one left to expose the truth. "You're a monster," she whispered, the full scope of his evil finally becoming clear to her. "You've corrupted everything you've touched, turned this whole territory into your personal killing ground." "I'm a businessman," Jeremiah corrected. "I saw an opportunity, and I took it. The gold was here, waiting to be claimed, and I had the vision and the courage to claim it. If that makes me a monster, then so be it." He nodded to his mercenaries, and they began to close in around her. Ophelia looked down at Nashtak's still form, at the blood that stained the sacred ground of his ancestors, and felt something break inside her chest. The brave chief had died trying to save his people, had sacrificed everything in a desperate attempt to expose the truth. "Wait," she said, an idea forming in her mind. "Before you kill me, don't you want to know how I found out about your operations? Don't you want to know who else might have this information?" Jeremiah paused, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Go on. The Modoc have been keeping records," Ophelia said, the lie forming even as she spoke. "Written records of every white man who entered their territory, every transaction, every meeting. They know about your involvement, about the deals you made with the army geologists." "Impossible," Jeremiah said, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "The Modoc don't have a written language, they learned," Ophelia said, pressing her advantage. My father taught some of them to read and write, showed them how to keep medical records and supply lists. They've been documenting everything, creating a complete account of your crimes. Where are these records? Jeremiah demanded, his composure finally cracking. Hidden, Ophelia said. In a place where your mercenaries will never find them. Kill me, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering when those records will surface, wondering when the truth will come out. You're bluffing, Jeremiah said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Am I? Ophelia asked. Can you afford to take that chance? Can you afford to let those records exist, knowing that they could destroy everything you've built? The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of dripping water, and the distant echo of wind through stone passages. Jeremiah stood frozen, his mind clearly racing as he weighed the risks of her claim against the certainty of silencing her forever. That's when the real miracle happened. From the depths of the cave system came a sound that made every man in. The chamber freeze, the distinctive war cry of Modoc warriors, echoing through the stone passages like the voice of vengeance itself. The sound was followed by the thunder of running feet, the clash of steel on steel, and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Impossible, Jeremiah breathed, his face going pale. The Modoc are defeated, scattered, broken. Not all of them, a new voice said from the chamber entrance, and Ophelia's heart leaped as she recognized the speaker. Gray Wolf, Nashdaq's most trusted lieutenant, stood in the doorway with a dozen warriors behind him, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. My chief, Gray Wolf said, his eyes finding Nashdaq's fallen form. We tracked the white killers to this sacred place, followed their trail through the darkness. We have come to avenge the dead and reclaim what was stolen. The mercenaries spun around, their weapons shifting to target the new threat, but they were caught between two fires now, the Modoc warriors at the entrance and Ophelia behind them. The tactical situation had changed completely, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Ophelia felt a flicker of hope. Kill them all. Jeremiah screamed, his composure finally shattered. Kill the Indians, kill the girl, kill anyone who threatens our operations. The chamber erupted into chaos as the two forces clashed in the confined space of the cave. Gunfire strobed through the darkness, war cries echoed off the stone walls, and the ancient burial ground of the Modoc people became a battlefield once again. But this time, Ophelia realized justice had arrived with war paint and steel. This time, the truth would not be buried with the dead. She clutched the satchel of documents to her chest and prepared to fight for the future of both peoples, knowing that everything depended on the outcome of this final, desperate battle in the sacred caves. The curse of the Modoc gold was about to be broken. One way or another, the sacred chamber had become a charnel house, its ancient walls splattered with blood and echoing with the screams of the dying. Ophelia McKenna pressed herself against the cold stone as bullets whined overhead. The leather satchel of incriminating documents clutched to her chest like a talisman against the chaos surrounding her. The battle between Gray Wolf's warriors and her uncle's mercenaries had reached a fever pitch, with neither side willing to give ground in the narrow confines of the cave. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see Gray Wolf himself locked in deadly combat with two of Jeremiah's men, his war axe singing through the air in deadly arcs that spoke of years of training and a lifetime of warfare. The Modoc warriors moved like shadows made flesh, their knowledge of the cave system giving them a crucial advantage over the mercenaries who stumbled and cursed in the unfamiliar darkness. The gold. Jeremiah's voice cut through the din, high and desperate now. Secure the gold. We can't let them take it. But his carefully laid plans were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. The mercenaries who had seemed so professional and coordinated just moments before were now scattered and demoralized, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of enemies they had believed to be defeated. The element of surprise had shifted. To the Modoc warriors, and they pressed their advantage with the ruthless efficiency of men, fighting for their sacred ground. Ophelia crawled toward where Chief Nashtak lay motionless, her heart breaking as she saw the extent of his wounds. Blood soaked the front of his shirt, and his breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible. But as she knelt beside him, his eyes fluttered open, and she saw that the fire of life still burned within them. "The documents," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of battle. Did you get them?" "Yes," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "I have them. The proof of everything your uncle has done, everything he's planned. But we need to get you out of here, need to get you medical attention." "No," Nashtak said, his hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "My time is over. But yours. Yours is just beginning. You must take the truth to the world, must make sure that justice is served. I won't leave you," Ophelia said firmly. "Not after everything you've sacrificed, everything you've done to protect your people. You must," Nashtak insisted, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. "The gold. It's not just cursed because of the deaths it has caused. It's cursed because it represents everything that is wrong with the way your people and mine have dealt with each other. Greed instead of understanding, violence instead of cooperation, lies instead of truth." A bullet struck the stone near Ophelia's head, sending chips of rock flying. She ducked instinctively, but Nashtak's grip on her wrist never loosened. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "The cave system. There's another way out. A passage that leads to the river, to safety. Grey Wolf knows it, will guide you if you ask. But you must go now before it's too late. What about you?" Ophelia asked, though she already knew the answer. "I will hold them here," Nashtak said, his voice growing stronger despite his wounds. "I will make sure they cannot follow you, cannot stop you from reaching the authorities with the proof of their crimes. You'll die," Ophelia said, the words tearing at her heart. "I was already dead," Nashtak replied with a sad smile. "From the moment I chose to oppose the killings, from the moment I decided that truth was more important than tribal loyalty. This is just ... The final chapter. Before Ophelia could protest further, a new voice entered the chaos, one that made her blood run cold with recognition. "Enough." Jeremiah McKenna stood at the entrance to the chamber, no longer the composed businessman, but a wild-eyed man on the edge of complete breakdown. In his hands he held a stick of dynamite, its fuse already lit and burning down toward the explosive. "Charge! Everyone stop or I'll bring this whole cave down on our heads." The fighting ceased as both sides recognized the threat. Grey Wolf's warriors froze in place, their weapons still raised but their targets suddenly irrelevant. The surviving mercenaries looked at their employer with expressions of horror and disbelief. "You're insane," one of them said. "You'll kill us all. Better to die rich than live poor," Jeremiah snarled, his composure completely shattered. "I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let it all be taken away by a bunch of savages and a meddling girl." "Uncle," Ophelia said, slowly rising from beside Nashtak's prone form. "Think about what you're doing. If you detonate that dynamite, you'll destroy everything, the gold, the evidence, all of it. You'll have nothing left." "I'll have my revenge," Jeremiah said, his eyes wild with madness. "If I can't have the gold, then no one can. If I can't escape justice, then I'll take everyone with me, including yourself," Ophelia pointed out, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable. "Is that really what you want? To die in a cave, buried under tons of rock, remembered only as a madman who threw away everything he'd worked for? Better than being remembered as a failure," Jeremiah said, but she could see the doubt beginning to creep into his eyes. "Better than facing the hangman's noose, than spending my final years in prison. There's another way," Ophelia said, taking a careful step forward. "Give me the dynamite, surrender peacefully, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial. I'll testify about the circumstances, about how the killing started, about how you got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. You think I'm a fool? Jeremiah laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. You think I don't know what happens to men like me? They'll hang me from the highest tree, make an example of me for every other would-be profiteer in the territory. Maybe, Ophelia said honestly. But at least you'll have a chance to tell your side of the story, to explain how things went wrong. At least you'll die with some dignity intact. Dignity? Jeremiah's voice rose to a shriek. What dignity is there in dying at the end of a rope, dancing for the entertainment of a bloodthirsty crowd? What dignity is there in being remembered as a monster? More dignity than there is in dying like a cornered rat, Grey Wolf said, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber. His voice was calm, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. More dignity than destroying the sacred places of my people because you cannot bear to face the consequences of your actions. Sacred places? Jeremiah spat. These are just holes in the ground, filled with dead Indians and stolen gold. There's nothing sacred about them. You're wrong, Nashtak said, his voice weak but clear. He had managed to prop himself up against the cave wall, and despite his wounds, his presence seemed to fill the chamber. These caves are sacred because they contain the bones of our ancestors, the spirits of those who came before us. They are sacred because they represent the connection between the living and the dead, between the past and the future. Superstitious nonsense, Jeremiah said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Nashtak asked. Then why do you seem so afraid? Why do your hands shake when you hold that dynamite? Why do you look over your shoulder as if something is watching you from the shadows? I'm not afraid, Jeremiah said, but his voice cracked as he spoke. I'm not afraid of anything. You're afraid of the truth, Ophelia said, understanding flooding through her. You're afraid that when you die, when you face whatever comes after, you'll have to answer for what you've done here. You're afraid that there really is something sacred about these caves, something that will judge you for the evil you've committed. Shut up. Jeremiah screamed, his composure finally shattering completely. Shut up, shut up, shut up. He raised the dynamite, preparing to throw it into the chamber, but as he did so, something extraordinary happened. The air in the cave began to change, growing thick and heavy with an energy that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. The temperature dropped suddenly, and everyone in the chamber could see their breath misting in the frigid air. The spirits, Grey Wolf whispered, his voice filled with awe and reverence. The ancestors are here. The cave paintings on the walls began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, and the shadows seemed to shift and move as if they were alive. Whispers echoed through the chamber, speaking in the ancient tongue of the Modoc. People, and even those who couldn't understand the words, could feel the power behind them. No, Jeremiah said, backing away from the glowing walls. This isn't real. This is just ... Just some kind of trick, some kind of hallucination. Look around you, Nashtak said, his voice growing stronger as the spiritual energy filled the chamber. Look at the faces of your men, at the fear in their eyes. They can see it too, Ken. Feel the presence of those who have been wronged by your greed. Indeed, the mercenaries were backing away from the glowing walls, their weapons forgotten in their terror. Some were crossing themselves, others were mumbling prayers, and all of them were looking at their employer with expressions of horror and disgust. You brought us here, one of them said, his voice shaking. You brought us to this cursed place, made us desecrate the dead, made us complicit in your crimes. I made you rich, Jeremiah said desperately. I gave you more money than you ever dreamed of. Blood money, another mercenary said, throwing down his rifle. Money paid for with the lives of innocent people. I won't be part of this anymore. One by one, the mercenaries began to lay down their weapons, their resolve broken by the supernatural events unfolding around them. The glowing walls seemed to be showing them visions of their victims, the faces of the men they had killed to protect Jeremir's secret. "Don't leave me," Jeremir pleaded, his voice breaking. "Don't abandon me here with these savages and their demon spirits. The only demons here are the ones you brought with you," Grey Wolf said, his voice filled with quiet dignity. "The spirits of our ancestors are not evil, they are guardians, protectors of the sacred places. They have come to witness justice being done." "Justice?" Jeremir laughed wildly. "What justice is there in this? I saw an opportunity, and I took it. I used the resources available to me to build wealth and power. That's not a crime, that's business. You murdered 17 innocent men," Ophelia said, her voice cutting through his ravings like a blade. "You turned the Modoc warriors into your unwitting accomplices, made them believe they were protecting their sacred places when they were really protecting your criminal enterprise. You corrupted everything you touched, turned a war between peoples into a cover for your greed. And now you want to judge me?" Jeremir snarled. "You, a woman who has never built anything, never created anything of value. You want to stand in judgment of a man who has the vision and the courage to seize opportunity when it presents itself." "I want to see justice done," Ophelia said simply. "I want to see the truth exposed, the guilty punished, and the innocent vindicated. I want to see both our peoples freed from the curse of this gold and the lies that have been told about it." "The gold is not cursed," Jeremir said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just metal, just a tool that can be used to build wealth and power. Then why are you so afraid to let it go?" Nashtak asked. "Why are you willing to die rather than give it up? Why does the thought of losing it drive you to madness?" "Because it's mine," Jeremir screamed. "I found it, I claimed it, I protected it. It belongs to me by right of conquest, by right of superior force." "You found nothing," Grey Wolf said calmly. "You stole the knowledge from a trusting man, used it to violate sacred ground, and then committed murder to protect your theft. There's no right of conquest here, only the right of the strong to prey upon the weak. And what's wrong with that?" Jeremir demanded. "That's the way the world works, the way it's always worked. The strong take what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. That's not evil, that's nature." "No," Ophelia said firmly. "That's not nature, that's a choice. You chose to see other people as obstacles to be removed, rather than as fellow human beings worthy of respect. You chose to value gold over life, profit over principle, power over compassion. Those were your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." "I won't live with anything," Jeremir said, raising the dynamite again. "I'll die as I lived on my own terms, taking what I want and destroying what I can't have." But as he prepared to throw the explosive, something unexpected happened. The dynamite suddenly grew too heavy for his hands, as if it were made of lead rather than wood and chemicals. He strained to lift it, his face turning red with effort, but the stick remained firmly planted in his grasp. "The spirits," Grey Wolf said softly. "They will not let you destroy what they have protected for so long. No," Jeremir said, his voice breaking with desperation. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "It's as real as the blood on your hands," Nashtak said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "As real as the lives you've taken, the trust you've betrayed, the sacred places you've defiled. The spirits of our ancestors have seen everything, and they will not let evil triumph in this place." The dynamite began to smoke and crackle, but instead of exploding, it simply crumbled to dust in Jeremir's hands. He stared at the remains in horror, his last weapon against justice literally disintegrating before his eyes. "It's over," Ophelia said, stepping forward with the satchel of documents. "The evidence is safe, the truth will be told, and justice will be served. Your reign of terror ends here, in the sacred caves of the Modoc people." Jeremir looked around the chamber, seeing the determined faces of the warriors, the disgust of his former mercenaries, the implacable resolve of his niece. He was alone now, abandoned by everyone, facing the consequences of his actions for the first time in his life. "I could have given you everything," he said to Ophelia, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wealth, power, position, everything a woman could want in this world. You could have given me a family," Ophelia replied sadly. "You could have been the uncle I remembered from childhood, the man who taught me to read, who told me stories, who made me laugh when I was sad. Instead, you chose to become a monster. I chose to be strong," Jeremiah said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "You chose to be weak," Nashtak corrected. "You chose the easy path of violence and deception rather than the difficult path of honor and truth. You chose to be ruled by your greed rather than guided by your conscience. And now?" Jeremiah asked, his voice breaking. "What happens to me now?" "Now you face justice," Grey Wolf said simply. "You will be taken to the territorial capital, where you will stand trial for your crimes. You will have the chance to confess, to seek forgiveness, to make what amends you can for the evil you have done. And if I refuse?" Jeremiah asked. "Then you will be judged by the spirits of those you have wronged," Nashtak said. "And their justice will be far harsher than anything the white man's law could devise." Jeremiah looked around the chamber one last time, seeing the glowing walls, the watching shadows, the faces of the dead that seemed to peer at him from every corner. He was a broken man now, his empire of crime crumbling around him, his dreams of wealth and power reduced to dust. "I surrender," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I surrender to whatever justice awaits me." The glow in the cave walls began to fade, and the oppressive spiritual energy that had filled the chamber started to dissipate. The crisis was over, the truth had been revealed, and justice would be served. But as Ophelia knelt beside the dying Chief Nashtak, she knew that the real work was just beginning. "The gold," she said to Grey Wolf. "What will happen to it now?" "It will be returned to the sacred places," Grey Wolf said firmly. "Sealed away where it can do no more harm, where it can rest in peace with the spirits of our ancestors." "And the bodies?" Ophelia asked, thinking of the 17 men whose families still didn't know their fate. "They will be given proper burial," Grey Wolf promised. "With honor, with dignity, with the respect that was denied them in death." "And the two peoples?" Ophelia asked, thinking of the war that had torn the territory apart. "What hope is there for peace between the Modoc and the white settlers?" "There is always hope," Nashtak said, his voice growing weaker but his spirit still strong. "When truth replaces lies, when justice replaces vengeance, when understanding replaces hatred, there is always hope." He reached out and took Ophelia's hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his wounds. "You are that hope," he said. "You are the bridge between our peoples, the proof that understanding is possible." "I'm just one person," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "I can't change the world." "You already have," Nashtak said with a smile. "You chose to save a buried man rather than walk away. You chose to seek truth rather than accept lies. You chose to risk everything for justice rather than live safely with injustice. Those choices have already changed the world." With those words, Chief Nashtak closed his eyes for the final time, his spirit joining those of his ancestors in the sacred caves. But his legacy would live on in the woman who had saved him, in the truth that had been revealed, and in the hope that justice and understanding might yet triumph over hatred and greed. The curse of the Modoc gold was finally broken, not by violence or vengeance, but by the simple power of truth and the courage of those willing to speak it. 3 months after the confrontation in the sacred caves, Ophelia McKenna stood on the steps of the territorial courthouse in Salem, Oregon, watching as her uncle Jeremiah was led away in shackles. The trial had been swift and decisive, the evidence she had recovered from the caves proving beyond any doubt his guilt in the murders of 17 innocent men. The judge had sentenced him to life in prison, sparing him the hangman's noose only because of Ophelia's testimony about his deteriorating mental state. The courthouse square was packed with onlookers, a mixture of white settlers and Modoc representatives, who had come to witness justice being served. Among them stood Grey Wolf, now the acknowledged leader of the surviving Modoc people, his weathered face showing satisfaction at seeing the man who had caused so much suffering finally brought to account. Beside him stood other tribal leaders, men and women who had lost family members to the violence that had consumed the territory. "Miss McKenna," a voice called out, and Ophelia turned to see Judge Benjamin Morrison approaching, his judicial robes replaced by a simple black suit. "I wanted to thank you personally for your courage in bringing this matter to light. Without your testimony and the evidence you provided, we might never have known the truth about what happened here. I didn't do it alone," Ophelia said quietly, thinking of Chief Nashtak's sacrifice and the price he had paid for choosing justice over tribal loyalty. Many people suffered to expose this truth, and some paid with their lives. "Chief Nashtak will be remembered as a hero," Judge Morrison said solemnly. "His name will be carved on the memorial we're erecting for all the victims of this tragedy, both white and Modoc. History will record that he chose to do what was right, even when it meant standing against his own people." The memorial was one of several initiatives that had emerged from the trial's aftermath. The territorial government, embarrassed by the extent of the corruption that had been revealed, had launched a comprehensive investigation into land speculation and mineral rights fraud. New laws were being drafted to prevent similar schemes, and oversight committees were being established to monitor government contracts and business dealings. "What will you do now?" Judge Morrison asked. "I understand you've been offered a position with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, helping to negotiate the new treaties." "I'm considering it," Ophelia said, though she remained uncertain about working for the same government that had allowed such corruption to flourish. "The Modoc people deserve better than they've received, and if I can help ensure they get fair treatment, then perhaps some good can come from all this tragedy." The new treaties were indeed being negotiated, but under vastly different circumstances than anyone had anticipated. The revelation of Jaramir's crimes had shifted public opinion dramatically, with many settlers now viewing the Modoc resistance as justified self-defense rather than savage aggression. The territorial government, eager to avoid further scandal, was offering unprecedented concessions, including the right to remain on ancestral lands and compensation for the damages caused by the illegal mining operations. "The gold," Judge Morrison said, lowering his voice. "I understand it's been returned to the caves, as the Modoc requested." "All of it," Ophelia confirmed. Grey Wolf insisted that every ounce be placed back where it was found, and the caves sealed permanently. He said the spirits of the ancestors demanded it, and after what I witnessed in those caves, I'm not inclined to argue with their judgment. The sealing of the caves had been a solemn ceremony, attended by representatives from both peoples and blessed by Modoc spiritual leaders. The gold that had caused so much death and suffering was now entombed forever, its curse broken by the return to sacred ground. The cave entrances had been filled with concrete and marked with warnings in both English and the Modoc language, ensuring that future generations would know to leave the site undisturbed. "Miss McKenna," another voice called out, and Ophelia turned to see Dr. Sarah Wellington approaching, her medical bag in hand. Dr. Wellington was one of the few female physicians in the territory, and she had been instrumental in treating the wounded from both sides during the recent troubles. "I wanted to speak with you about the clinic proposal." The clinic was another project that had emerged from the tragedy's aftermath. Using funds seized from Jaramir's criminal enterprise, the territorial government had agreed to establish a medical facility that would serve both white settlers and Native Americans. Dr. Wellington had been appointed as the chief physician, and she had offered Ophelia the position of head nurse and liaison to the tribal communities. "I've been thinking about your offer," Ophelia said. The idea of serving both peoples, of using healing to bridge the divisions that have caused so much pain, it appeals to me. My father would have approved. Your father would have been proud, Dr. Wellington said warmly. From what I've heard, he was a man who believed in the power of medicine to transcend racial and cultural barriers. This clinic could be a living memorial to his ideals. The clinic would be built on neutral ground, equidistant from the main white settlement and the Modoc reservation. It would be staffed by both white and Native American healers, combining traditional medicine with modern medical knowledge. The goal was to create a place where both peoples could receive care without fear or prejudice, where the sick and injured would be treated based on their need rather than their race. There's something else, Dr. Wellington said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Something I think you should know about your uncle's condition. What about it? Ophelia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. He's been claiming to see things in his cell. Dr. Wellington sighed quietly. Figures in the shadows, voices calling his name, visions of the men he had killed. The prison doctor thinks it's just guilt and madness, but the guards are starting to talk about his cell being haunted. Ophelia felt a chill run down her spine, remembering the supernatural events she had witnessed in the caves. The spirits of the Modoc ancestors had made their presence known once, and perhaps they were continuing to exact their justice on the man who had defiled their sacred places. Perhaps it's fitting, she said quietly. Perhaps some crimes are too great to be punished only by human law. Perhaps, Dr. Wellington agreed. In any case, I thought you should know. Now about the clinic position, have you made your decision? Yes, Ophelia said, feeling a sense of certainty settle over her. I'll take the position. It's time to start building something positive from all this destruction. As they spoke, Gray Wolf approached them, his expression grave but hopeful. He had aged visibly since the events. In the caves, the weight of leadership and loss taking its toll on his weathered features. But there was also a new sense of purpose in his bearing, a determination to ensure that his people's sacrifices would not be in vain. Miss McKenna, he said in carefully pronounced English. I have something for you. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. When Ophelia unwrapped it, she found a carved stone pendant, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. It belonged to Chief Nashtak, Gray Wolf explained. He wore it during ceremonies when he needed to commune with the spirits of our ancestors. He would have wanted you to have it, to carry his memory and his hopes for the future. Ophelia held the pendant reverently, feeling its weight and the history it represented. Nashtak had given his life to expose the truth, to break the cycle of violence and corruption that had consumed both peoples. Now it was her responsibility to carry on his work, to build the bridge between worlds that he had envisioned. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll treasure it always. The spirits speak to those who listen, Gray Wolf said. Chief Nashtak believed you were chosen for this purpose, that your path was guided by forces greater than ourselves. I believe he was right. As the crowd began to disperse from the courthouse square, Ophelia found herself thinking about the future. The trials and revelations had changed everything, but they had also created new possibilities. The clinic would be just the beginning. There would be schools to build, treaties to negotiate, wounds to heal between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. The work will be hard, Dr. Wellington said, reading her thoughts. There will be those on both sides who resist change, who prefer the old ways of suspicion and violence. But I believe we can make a difference, one patient at a time, one act of healing at a time. Chief Nashtak used to say that every ending is also a beginning, Ophelia said, clutching the pendant to her chest. The curse of the gold is broken. The truth has been revealed, and justice has been served. Now we have the chance to write a new chapter in the story of our two peoples. As the sun set over the Oregon Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ophelia McKenna stood at the crossroads of history. Behind her lay the tragedy and corruption that had nearly destroyed two peoples, but ahead lay the possibility of something better, a future built on truth instead of lies, on healing instead of violence, on understanding instead of hatred. The young woman who had once pulled a dying chief from his living grave now carried the hopes of both peoples in her heart. She had seen the worst that humanity could offer, but she had also witnessed the power of courage and conscience to triumph over greed and evil. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she would walk it with the spirit of Chief Nashtek guiding her steps and the memory of his sacrifice lighting her way. In the end, love had proven stronger than hate, truth more powerful than lies, and justice more enduring than corruption. The curse of the Modoc gold was broken forever, but its legacy would live on in the bonds of understanding forged between two peoples who had learned to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The story was ending, but the healing had just begun.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.